Hi, everybody. This is the Hungry Math Professor here, and today I'm going to continue my discussion of Against Method by Paul Feyerabend. This is part two, so you may want to go back and listen to part one first if you like. And in part two, I'm going to kind of roughly discuss chapters 6 through 14. And what unifies these chapters in Paul Feyerabend's book is that they all involve the Galileo as like the exemplar situation for Paul in all these chapters. The chapters cover different points of view, different ideas, but they all basically have something to do with the story of Galileo, because Galileo for Paul is like a great example of the kind of thing he thinks happens a lot in science. This like counterinduction and anything goes kind of mentality. Um, a need for propaganda at times to put your theories forward. And it's so Galileo for him, he argues that that's what Galileo does, and then he also argues that this is how scientists should behave in some sense. I'm going to start with a quote that he quotes Kant in the beginning of chapter 6 and says, "But where common sense believes that rationalizing sophists have the intention of shaking the very fundament of the commonwealth, then it would seem to be not only reasonable, but permissible and even praiseworthy to aid the good cause with sham reasons rather than leaving the advantage to the opponent." So, Paul is quoting this because he's saying that, like, even Kant here is seeming to say that, like when you're arguing against sophists who just come up with, terrible arguments and are convincing people of something you think to be untrue, then it's perhaps justified to counter their sophistry with, other propaganda to try to make sure that people are not convinced of this poor position. Now, that being said, for Paul, he thinks that like this idea of rational thought is like doesn't make sense from the get-go. And so for Paul, there is no like preferred position, which is like the true position. At least we couldn't know what the true position was, even if there was such a thing. And so, Kant presents it like, hey, I'm looking for the truth. These people are sophists and they're out here selling something to the masses that's convincing, and I need to counter that argument because I have the truth. And Paul is trying to say no one has the truth. Certainly, no one knows they have the truth. And there is no rational argument that could possibly like be a knockdown proof of absolute certainty anyway. So any argument that you make or any kind of rhetoric that you use is basically sophistry and propaganda to some degree. And we shouldn't necessarily look at this as such a bad thing because there's no other option in Paul's point of view. I mean, honestly, this to me follows from Wittgenstein's points in philosophical investigations and on certainty. So I think in that sense, his distrust of rationality, though he doesn't necessarily claim it comes from Wittgenstein directly, I think for me that is certainly one place I would trace that sort of philosophy back to. And before we move on, also, if you think to Plato in the Republic, where this first sort of bashing of sophists comes from, these sophists in Plato's mind are these people who just argue for the sake of arguing and have no interest in finding truth. And this bothers Plato because for Plato, these arguments should be taken seriously and should be a way of you should be looking for the truth, right? But again, Paul wants to turn this on his head and say, if you were convinced by Plato, you were just convinced by Plato's sophistry. You were just convinced by Plato's rhetoric, and that's fine, but it doesn't mean that Plato's regular rhetoric is somehow closer to the truth or somehow establishing some absolute certainty about what is true any more than the sophists were, or any more than any other philosopher, or any other thinker, or any other person who's offering you some myths or some philosophy, stories, science, blah, 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 blah. The question is whether you're convinced by these people. The question is whether they present something that you're attracted to and whether you want to do it or not, right? And it's not so much about whether it's truth, right? He really wants to. I think he's deeply skeptical of truth. Somewhere in the preface, Paul says, like, I'm a rationalist who, when I start looking at history and when I start looking at the foundations of things, I can't help but cry that there's a fire here, that this is not working the way that we intended. So he says it's somewhere that like he wanted rational thought to be the way to work, but as he examined it, he just couldn't see any way for this to work, right? Okay, so that I start out by saying that because Galileo is going to be somehow the exemplar for Paul of this kind of understanding this in the history and not backing down from this particular um, like understanding of how you have to argue for things. Okay, so in this chapter, he also talks about natural interpretations. So he says, making the additional simplifying assumption, we can now distinguish between sensations and those mental operations which follow so closely upon the senses, and which are so firmly connected with their reactions that a separation is difficult to achieve. Considering the origin and the effect of such operations, I shall call them natural interpretations. This has been something, that's been debated in philosophy ever since philosophy's been written down. When if you want to be an empiricist, you want to observe the natural world, and you want to be the case that when you observe the natural world, you just observe it, right? And you don't tamper with it at all. You just take the raw data of the physical world and analyze it. And that would be really ideal if it was like that. But we know that when we observe the world, we just use our eyes, for instance, we get some information from the world into our eyes, but it's not like we get this continuous image that I seem to see, right? I get some kind of data about the world and my mind reconstructs the image that I see. And, can I trust these reconstructions that my brain is doing? Of course, if you take certain kinds of drugs, those reconstructions change and you start hallucinating, or, if you go through some kind of um, psychosis or something like that, things change. And so there's lots of different ways that the data that was taken in through our eyes can be interpreted differently by our minds. And so anytime we want to observe the world in any way, we're constantly having to deal with the fact that we never just take in purely raw data from the world. It's just not how it works. And so he goes into this discussion of different philosophers' approaches to this. But just to kind of like get to the punchline of what Paul thinks, is like you can't unravel all of these natural interpretations, partly because they sort of these natural interpretations are interweb with each other. So you try to like just, Bacon's idea was to just, let's just unravel all the natural interpretations until we get to the raw data. But these things are like parasitic on each other, and there is no like if we were to get rid of all the natural interpretations, Paul's worried that we would be left with nothing. Like we can't even think anymore. We're not even the human being's not even present in the process anymore or something. And so he's very pessimistic about this idea that we could possibly completely unravel all of these different natural interpretations which get in the way of a pure raw observation of the world. And also because anytime you try to eliminate some natural interpretation, you're going to have to introduce some theory about that natural interpretation, and you've already gotten the game going by doing that, and you've already sort of like tainted the well from the very outset. So he's very he's very pessimistic about this. And then something else that comes up here, again, to get into the Galileo part, is there's a few aspects of Galileo that he wants to bring up. The first one is he wants to counter Aristotle's physics ideas that had been like taken hold. Aristotle's not around anymore, but his ideas have really calcified um, in the Western tradition that we're following here. And in particular, there's these arguments for the fact that the Earth does not rotate. And you have to put yourself back in the time at the time, if you just think of yourself, what have you really observed besides like videos and pictures that you've seen of the Earth rotating and things like that? If you just think about raw data that you've collected, besides maybe going in an airplane, if you're just walking around, and there's no airplanes in the time of this that we're talking about, so you're just walking around the Earth, it's perfectly reasonable to think that the Earth doesn't rotate. And it's not a crazy thought, right? If you just think about the sense data that you have. But one of the arguments they gave is they said, listen, you drop a rock off of a tall tower and the rock just goes straight down. And they say, listen, if the Earth was rotating and you drop the rock, then the Earth should keep rotating. The rock should go back this way, right? And the tower keeps rotating, the rock goes back down in the opposite direction because you just let it go, and the Earth should keep rotating as the rock falls and come fall on a diagonal. But they say that's not how we see it. The rock just falls straight down, so the Earth must not be rotating. Now, this is an interesting argument because if you put yourself back in the shoes and do the thought experiment, it's not a crazy argument. It actually makes some sense. And I'm not super familiar with Aristotle's physics, but what Paul argues is that Aristotle's physics also really backed up this argument and made it a solid argument, right? We might want to poke holes in it, but we're going to use some of our perspective that we have from a different sort of philosophy of science and a different epistemology, and so that's not really fair. And Galileo wants to argue for the Copernican view. And so he also wants to argue that the Earth rotates and also not only just rotates, but also goes around an orbit. But for now, let's just focus on the rotation. So Paul says, like, what can Galileo do? He doesn't really have any hardcore data to present. And so, what can he can't really present just raw data. So, Paul says Galileo has to use propaganda and psychological tricks to try to, one, um, to try to get people to let a little bit go of their hold on Aristotle's philosophy, not only his scientific ideas, but also his broader philosophical ideas. And so he tries to like remind um, the people at the time in his writings about like some of the things where you see relativity of motion, right? Now I'm going to present a more recent, like a common example for me. I remember as a kid being on a bus, and if you were next to a few buses, if the bus starts moving, sometimes it feels like you're moving and the other bus is standing still. And then at some point you might realize, oh no, my bus is actually standing still and the other bus is moving, right? And so it's this point that like sometimes it's hard to tell which one is happening. And so it's this idea of like relative motion that you're either moving with respect to the other point of reference, or the other point of reference is moving with respect to you. And sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. So Galileo brings up these kinds of examples to remind people that although your senses may be telling you that the earth is not moving, sometimes our senses don't quite tell us the right story. And this is trying to undermine some of Aristotle's philosophy, like epistemology and empirical philosophy, to try to get people to think slightly differently. Okay, so that is one way that he tries to change people's mind. So he's saying, like, listen, the Earth is rotating at the same time the tower is rotating, and so you're rotating as well, right? So you have to remember that even though you don't feel the rotation of the Earth, it's partly because you're rotating with the Earth, and so you're not feeling that relative motion. Um, and so that's one thing he has to do. But now there's still a problem because why is the ball not moving a different way? So he has to invent, is what how Paul says. He says, Galileo has to invent some idea, right? It's not something that he's observing about the world. This is not coming from empirical data. He's purely inventing the idea, the principle of circular inertia, which is basically saying that like something that's already has some circular velocity will continue with that circular velocity forever, and which doesn't quite work that way, but that's the principle. And the idea is that when the rock is let go of the tower, which is rotating, the rock also gets let go with that same circular rotation. So now the earth is rotating, you on the earth are rotating, the tower on the earth is rotating. You let go of the rock, it not only falls down, but it also has circular rotation to it as well. And so that's why the rock seems to just fall down, but that's because the circular rotation that the rock is undergoing, you are also undergoing, the earth is also undergoing, and so you don't notice that motion, right? So this is the argument that Galileo has to convince people of if he wants to convince them that it's reasonable for the earth to rotate. And what Paul keeps trying to remind us is that Galileo cannot argue for this via like empirical data. He doesn't have good empirical data to work with that we might be able to use now. Instead, he has to, um, you know, unlock the sort of calcification that Aristotle's ideas have had at the time and start to get you in the direction of thinking about these other ideas of relativity of motion and the principle of circular inertia. And again, propaganda, and he kind of paints Aristotle's ideas as old ideas or not, working the right way anymore, or somehow primitive or something. And Galileo understands how to use strong language to try to convince people of his position. Okay, so that's the first sort of thought experiment in for Galileo, is how you have to present basically a new metaphysics and a new epistemology. So the metaphysics is I'm gonna teach you about the principle of circular inertia and the rotating of the earth and things like that. And then the new epistemology is to say, hey, we can't always trust our senses. Aristotle took a more like naive realism about our senses, that we can trust them. But for Galileo now, we have to poke some holes in that so that you can be open to the idea of not perceiving relative motion, even though it's happening. Okay, so that's the first thing Paul wants to point out to. And now he's going to go on to Galileo's telescope. And he argues that Galileo offers no rational reason for trusting his telescope. Um, so, you can ask, like, how does one argue for the telescope? In general, you can ask like that question. You have to go back to the time and think about history. And what Paul is going to point out is that the part of the issue is that different fields of science will progress at different speeds, or will have better understanding of some things and worse understandings of others. And one of the issues with the telescope is that our scientific theories of optics were just like very primitive at the time. In order to make a telescope, you're going to need to use lenses. And so you need to have a good theory about how lenses work, which they don't really have at the time. And so what he used to do, right? So Galileo builds a telescope and he tests it by just looking at stuff on Earth and, with some kind of accuracy. But the problem, of course, the glaring problem is just because it works reasonably well on the kind of distances you can test on Earth does not mean it's going to work anywhere near reasonably well when you point it at the moon or point it at stars or planets or whatever, right? There's no reason why, just because it's good at seeing something, however many miles away, that it's going to be good at seeing things in the heavens, which are way further away. So, what do you do about this? Um, Again, not only that, but like early telescopes were giving lots of conflicting results. So if the raw empirical data should not have been very convincing, at least in Paul's mind. And so not only that, but there's like these drawings of the moon that Galileo made that seem to be pretty bad. It would have been better just to like use your naked eye, Paul argues. And he says that despite these conflicting telescope results, Galileo argues that the telescope is trustworthy and that it backs up his views about the Copernican idea that the Earth is not the center of the solar system, but rather rotates around the sun. And I think from Paul's point of view, again, you have to remember Paul is telling this story from his own perspective. I don't think he's completely lying about the details, but he's certainly emphasizing things differently. And you should look, different historians of science and historians in general are going to disagree about this story. In fact, the traditional story of Galileo is usually told differently. You might be aware of that. So we should keep that in mind. But from Paul's point of view, he's going to argue that um, Galileo might even be aware of the fact that there's some issues with this empirical data, but he so much believes in the Copernican view that he's going to make the argument anyway that his telescope is trustworthy, even though he doesn't really know that or has no good reasons for that, and that his telescope is not only trustworthy but also giving data which seems to suggest the Copernican view. Whereas in reality, Paul's going to say that there's some data that maybe suggests the Copernican view, but there's other data in the telescope that's not. So there's certainly no clear evidence. But again, in Paul's mind, this is not bad because when we look back at history, we needed to let go of the Aristotle view. We needed to let go of this view that the Earth was the center of the solar system and did not move. And so the only way to do that is to break through the calcification of Aristotle's scientific views, but also his epistemological, his metaphysical, and his philosophical views that have just become so calcified amongst the community that they needed to be broken up somehow. And if you don't do that, he's arguing that you would never be able to get, the Copernican view, right? You can poke holes in that if you like, but there's at least something to be said for when a view becomes so calcified amongst a group of people, it can be very difficult to get them to see the world differently, and that might require some very strong um, language or strong different arguments to try to break people free of this point of view, right? You can come up with other things in history where this happens. So in chapter 11, he says, irrational methods are needed because of the uneven development of the sciences. I said that to you before. He says science is a complex and heterogeneous historical process. And, Aristotle's views are so entrenched and comprehensive that we need something extreme to get unstuck from this worldview. And sometimes to overthrow the status quo, we need to take a step backwards to when theories were more vague to let empirical content catch up. Again, this step backwards is something that Kuhn pointed out to too, is that like when a new paradigm takes over, oftentimes the new paradigm can actually explain a lot less phenomena than the old paradigm. And in this case, he's arguing that like Galileo's views and the Copernican view that he's arguing for can explain a lot less phenomena actually than Aristotle's, but it's okay to take that step backwards in order to prepare for like a new paradigm moving forward. Just to be clear, Paul never really uses the word paradigm. This is Kuhn's word, but it's a useful word, I think, and so I will sometimes use that when I think it's appropriate. But I want to just emphasize this idea that science is a historical process. And again, going into Kuhn talks about how scientists, when they're being trained, rarely actually learn, the complete history of science, or maybe complete's a little bit too much, but they rarely go back and learn anything about the history of science. They just sometimes learn about the previous paradigm. But Kuhn argues that oftentimes when they learn about the previous paradigm, it's in this sort of propagandist sort of way where the current paradigm just presents the old paradigm as clearly deficient, and the new paradigm is clearly making progress, and this kind of revisionist history. And I think Paul definitely agrees with this point, and also wants to point out that um, you know we should appreciate the history. Why hide the history from the scientists? And the scientists should study this history so that they can better understand the actual way that these things progress in the past and how they might be progressing right now, and forget about, these stories that the philosophers of science like to tell about how science apparently works. Paul doesn't think that these things are correct. One question I had at this point between these, the Copernican view and the Aristotelian view that the Earth was the center of universe and didn't move. Why couldn't we just keep both views? Like, maybe this is a crazy thought, but I don't see why we can't just keep both views, like a real pluralism where we don't say one or the other is correct. We just literally take them both and keep testing them, keep working with them until we're forced to pick one or the other. Maybe there's something naive about that proposal, but it's something I keep thinking about because Paul keeps suggesting pluralism. And to me, pluralism requires not just multiple points of view, but also people to really entertain multiple points of view and really think about what those points of view are suggesting. And it's when you have multiple points of view and you actually take them all seriously, that to me, I think you get some benefit in having some kind of comprehensive understanding of what we understand at any given point in time. So why couldn't we just have both views? At some point, maybe I would have moved to the Copernican view. But why do we have to go from one to the other? Why can't we just keep both up in the air? Okay, as we move forward, he's going to now analyze like the trial, Galileo's trial by the church, and he argues that the way this story is usually told, he thinks is just way overblown. And he's going to argue that the church actually was being the more scientifically rational, and Galileo was being the more irrational. So that, the church famously said that that Galileo should stop sort of teaching the Copernican view as fact. They actually said, Paul claims that they allowed him to teach it as a hypothesis of some sort, but they couldn't teach it as fact, and they gave him some other punishments that I don't remember exactly. But they called him unscientific, and Paul claims that actually the church was right because the data fit better with this Aristotelian view at the time. And it reminds me of this principle of conservatism that comes up in Web of Belief by Quine, where you say you have some web of scientific beliefs, let's just say, and you have some new evidence that comes in, and you want to alter the web as little as possible to try to accommodate the new evidence. And in the Web of Belief, sort of conservative value point of view. And so, if that's the point of view that you have, then the church is doing that. They're saying, yeah, okay, maybe there's some evidence that's starting to point that maybe Aristotle's views are not right. Maybe there isn't, but there's certainly not enough evidence to change our stance from an institution point of view, from the Aristotelian perspective, which is also seems to be corroborated by some scripture in the Bible and things like that. We just don't have enough evidence to go, wholesale and change everything over to this Galilean view. If you had more evidence, Galileo, then maybe we would be convinced. But since you don't, this is the more rational thing to do, to keep the way things are. And actually, from the way Paul presents it, I don't necessarily disagree. I actually remember, I went to a Christian college, Messiah College, now it's called Messiah University for college, and I took a philosophy of religion class, and I remember my professor, um, Dr. Miller, making an argument like this, that the church was actually being reasonable at the time of Galileo. I'm not sure if he got that from against method. He may have just gotten that from some other argument. Um, but I remember him making that same argument that actually the church made the right decision given the evidence at the time. And I think it's a worthwhile point of view to think about. And then he makes the claim that if you think the church was wrong, or you think the church was being too sort of black and white or stuck in their ways or not open to new ideas, then Paul's going to say the modern scientific institutions are just as stuck in their ways and see the world just as black and white as the church did at the time of Galileo. So you can't have one or the other, he's saying, right? If you think the church was wrong at the time, then you need to look at scientific institutions now and say that they're being wrong. And vice versa, you can go either way, but he's trying to say, he's trying to use your rationality against you and try to get you to see that it doesn't quite work, this sort of clean sort of scientific development that you have in your mind that you were sold to by scientists or wherever you were sold this from. Just it's not how it happens in history. It's just not how it happens. And he's really worried about how much power the modern scientific institution has in his mind. He also points out that the Bible is just vastly richer in life lessons than science will ever be. And, he talks about how scientism has left a giant abyss, which was once filled by meaningful myths. And this is something I've heard people talk about too when they talk about like Eastern medicine versus Western medicine, or they want to just criticize medicine in general, that somehow medicine has reduced us down to some like abstract sequence of like symptoms and diagnoses where really, humans are more complex than that. We need to take some kind of holistic view of our mental health and our physical health and our meaning. Do we have meaning in our lives? Do we have spiritual health? And that we need to take this sort of bigger view of what it means to be human and what it means to be healthy. And I think Paul seems to agree with this sort of point of view. And there was a quote on page 132 that I wanted to read in this vein. Um, He says that I argued that knowledge needs a plurality of ideas, that well-established theories are never strong enough to terminate the existence of alternative approaches, and that a defense of such alternatives being almost the only way of discovering the errors of highly respected and comprehensive points of view is required even by a narrow philosophy such as empiricism. Um, so, again, he's arguing that he really wants things to not be so black and white, not to be so institutionalized to where we place too many rules and too many restrictions on things, and then we can't really. He thinks that actually uh, is counterproductive, and then scientists can't be creative and can't actually do what they need to do to come up with new, interesting, and beautiful ideas. And he says, if you look at the history of science, that's just not how it's been, right? And he talks about how theology was a real boundary condition on science at that time. And so it was reasonable to expect that the church would have some sort of say in whether scientific theory should be accepted or not. He also talks about how Newton would talk about God in various different ways in his arguments. Um, and he also talks about at the time that there was this like firm separation between math and science for Aristotle. And that's interesting to think about if you go back into your Plato versus Aristotle philosophy. When you think of Plato, his rough ideas were like the physical world is lying to us. It's just a pale version of what we're really after. And so he's trying to get to the Platonic world of the forms. And so somehow, if you think of the parable of the cave, right? The physical world is like these just shadows on the wall, and we want to find is what's actually creating the shadows, right? And so he gives various different ways to try to do that. But for him, mathematics, because it's so abstract, is somehow a bridge to that, right? So it's not exactly what he's looking for. He's looking for like these Platonic forms, but because of the abstraction of mathematics, it's not about the physical world, about some other abstract world. He thinks that mathematics kind of gets us towards the right direction. But for Aristotle, it's reversed because Aristotle says, yeah, we want to find the essence of things, these forms. But for him, you find the forms amongst the world. So actually, you find out the essence of things by studying the world around you very carefully. And so it becomes much more empirical. And so for him, the abstraction of mathematics is actually not seen as such a good thing. I don't think he's against mathematics or anything like that, but he wants to make a separation between certain areas of science and mathematics. And so Paul points out that because of that, certain areas of astronomy and things were not as mathematical at the time. And Galileo, as well as others, started to introduce more mathematics into certain areas of science. So that was, again, another aspect where we had to tear down some of the philosophical views of Aristotle, some of the epistemology and his metaphysics about forms and the essence of things needed to be sort of torn down a little bit so that we can introduce new ideas. Um, and he keeps talking about the inadequacies of the philosophy of science account. So at the very end of this chapter, he goes through several different of the chapter 14, where I'm going to end this video. He goes through several of the different um, competing, you know, philosophies of science. So he has like naive empiricism. So this is like Aristotle and the Middle Ages and things like that. Then he has sophisticated empiricism, um, where they built on some of those ideas and changed some of the epistemology. Then he talks about falsificationism of Popper. He has some conventionalism. He talks about the logical positivists. And then he talks about the theory of crisis by Kuhn. I won't go through all his examples here, but basically he goes through each of these sort of competing philosophies of science and uses these examples of Galileo to show that none of these theories explain all of the what we see in the history of science. And so his point is not that we can't learn from these various different philosophies of science, because these various different philosophies of science are explaining at times just periods in history and how people thought about science in those periods of history. And they also could be explaining certain things going on in the history of science at certain different times very well. And so, I think Paul is open to the idea of like mixing and matching all these different views of science. But I think he is against this idea that you could possibly lay down a complete theory of how science works and actually be right, right? He's very against that. That's why it's called against method. It's against the idea of putting down rules about how science works. And he also introduces like counterinduction and says anything goes right from the beginning to point out the idea that there should be no guardrails on the way that we are allowed to progress and think about and be curious about the world, right? I really see Paul as just like this deeply curious person who wants no restrictions, right? Just like let me play, let me paint the way I want to paint, and let me do what I want to do and be as creative as I possibly can and be as curious as I want and when I'm trying to discover the world. And he wants to see sort of everybody do that. Okay, that's as far, for now, his end of his discussion of Galileo. And I will do another video discussing the next parts of the book. Please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what you think about this discussion or what you think about Paul's ideas. And I hope to see you at another video.